All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, welcome to this WKO workshop on Dynamic Functional Reserve Capacity, or dFRC. My name is Tim Cusick. I am the Training Peaks WKO product leader, and I'll be leading you through today's exercise. This is one of the first new workshops. I've been hinting in the group that we're going to come out with some new educational formats. I'm going to actually close on the new format. We decided not to announce it to January 4th, I think is the date, or 3rd, what the new education is going to be, just because launching anything over the holidays is problematic. So we're going to wait till then. But this workshop format is one of the new things, shorter, more specific to the point, and they're actually going to be related on trying to answer questions out of the Facebook group, and then they'll end up back on the WKO5.com quick start. All right, so let's just jump right in and move pretty quickly. I have a short presentation and we'll muck around with some of the questions and probably in my WKO. To understand dynamic functional reserve, let's just recap what functional reserve capacity is, FRC. And FRC is the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise above FTP before fatigue occurs. That means if I go hard, harder being higher than FTP, how long and how hard can I go continuously? So once I rest, though, that's not necessarily what functional reserve capacity is. Now we get more into dynamic functional reserve. FRC is how hard and how long can I go above threshold in a continuous effort. Functional reserve capacity can be found throughout the software, up here in the hero bar, and numerous reports and places. Hopefully by now everybody's been able to find it pretty quickly. How do we measure functional reserve capacity, FRC? Well, and this is kind of important because it's going to play into dFRC, it is a modeled defined metric. So FRC is an output of the power duration model, which is based off your mean max power, the work that you've actually done. Model defined FRC, it's very similar to your anaerobic work capacity, but basically it takes into account the small amount of aerobic contribution to power. Go out and do a 1 minute as hard as you can go. That's not all anaerobic power. Some of it is, or most of it is, right? But you're still breathing. You're still making some of it aerobically. You can think of FRC as like your anaerobic battery, and that anaerobic battery operates in the absence of oxygen. And finally, once your FRC is depleted, you must rest and recover to recharge it. That's going to also be important. All right, let's talk about dynamic functional reserve capacity. And really, it's just dynamic tracking of the effect of work on the athlete's functional reserve capacity. And in its simplest terms, and it's in kilojoules as a measure, by the way, if you go out and do let's change the word work for the moment for simplicity. If you go out and generate power, and when you generate that power above threshold, you are draining down the functional reserve capacity. Now remember, functional reserve capacity is continuous work over threshold. So I have a couple, a simple chart here. I'm not sure, this is kind of a gathering of intervals. I'm actually going to demo this in WKO5 here in a minute. I will warn you, I'm testing something new right now. You might see some things on my screen that you can't have yet, or you don't have, but to be honest with you, you should get them tomorrow morning. So here we see a power output of a file. You can see this person is doing, actually they're doing 40-20 intervals here. We can see the 40-20 intervals. The purple line is their dynamic functional reserve. And basically what it means by dynamic is it's measuring that functional reserve capacity, or that anaerobic battery. Here we can see they're rolling out pretty easy. The battery really isn't getting drained. There's a little bit of a push here, but a little bit of that is anaerobic power. But then they just kind of steady out. And it's not to here. It looks like they're doing some warm-ups, right? Some high cadence or some harder efforts getting ready for the intervals. Drain the battery. So as the purple line goes down, you'll see that it's in kilojoules, going from approximately 15 kilojoules, which would be their FRC. Would have helped, I guess, if I left that up here. And they drain it down, and then as they go easier, that battery is recharging back up. They start some intervals. We can see these are, I can see by the description, they're 40-20, so they're going 40 seconds on, 20 seconds easy, 40 seconds on, 20 seconds easy. You can see during the 40 seconds on, they're draining, a little bit of recharge in the 20, drain all the way down. And we can see this athlete took their FRC down to about 8 kilojoules. So that's the spending. They went from about 15 to 8. So they drained down to about, 7 kilojoules down, but they still had a lot in the tank. They rest in between, so some amount of recharge occurs. They do the second one, it goes a little lower. Obviously, they went harder on the second one. You could see here, for the people already gauging, what I can see, and you could probably see, they're holding back, right? They're saving some here. They're not going super hard in these two intervals. They they rest in between the third one. Now they're starting to go harder, right? So this is actually a pretty good interval set. They probably held back too much on this, which I'll get into here later. Probably held back, though, too much here. Then you see the third one, they go all the way down here to about -2. And then on the fourth one, they really go deep, right? They empty the tank and they're right about 0. They're getting pretty close to 0. Then they kind of go and ride home. They're no longer going anaerobic. The battery slowly recharges up and eventually, kind of just as they're finishing up, gets back to close to recharged. So dynamic functional reserve, all you're doing is measuring the dynamic utilization, and dynamic meaning it's a response to power, to work that you're doing, right? And it's just dynamic. How are we draining and recharging that battery over time? Now, when we look at that, one of the problems with data like this, where we're using model data, and particularly in dynamic functional reserve, is we have to understand that this is not a perfect metric. There's unique challenges that come, and it's why we've resisted doing it for so many years, but yet the demand was there and high. We finally wanted to do it. We do think we have a better solution that's out there in the marketplace. There's some other programs that can do this. We think ours is better, and I can even tell you why when we get there. But that being said, it's not perfect. There's certain variables that are really hard to overcome in this session. Is anybody else having a hard time hearing me? Or I should have asked that right from the get-go. Sorry, I just saw somebody report they can't hear me well. I'll turn up. Can anybody type in the question box that they can hear me all good? Okay, great. I turned up a little bit. Hopefully that will help and I can speak louder. So the challenges of dFRC are this, right? Measuring the burn rate, and the burn rate is when this is going down. That's actually reasonably easy with a good model. What really presents the challenge is the recovery rate. It's this part, right? And it's this part not only between intervals, but over time, over the life of the whole workout. That is really where the challenge occurs, and it's where the errors occur. And what the errors occurring from that are, and they're based on this fact, right? First, we have massive individuality in our recovery rate as human beings. We actually put out power kind of in a semi-patternistic way, but recovery, we vary more between individuals than you would think. Then once we consider that, we also have variables in the recovery system. Do 5 hard workouts in a row and don't eat really well, your ability to recover between intervals, after the 5th or the 4th workout, and then suddenly you start doing yet another day of intervals and you haven't been eating and recharging well, your recovery rate is really compromised. And that's a variable that WKO simply doesn't know. It doesn't know if you're eating right in between training days. It doesn't know if you're carb depleted and on the keto diet or something crazy like that. It doesn't know those variables. So it assumes the variables. And that kind of bell curves everything, which means it works pretty fair for a lot of people. But there might be days where like, man, my recovery said I was recovered, but I was trashed. Well, then go back. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you doing too much work? Are you deeply fatigued? It just doesn't know. It's information the system doesn't have. Another variable is simply fitness. It doesn't necessarily, the dFRC is a workout metric specifically related to that workout. One of the things we want to do with it in the future is better link it to, in its simplest terms, your CTL. It wouldn't be that simple. It's way more complex, but getting a better understanding of your fitness. And there's also, in some ways, I like using this word or phrase. In other ways, I hate. There's a slow component. Depending on when you do the intervals and how deep into the workout and how many intervals, there's an underlying fatigue, which is just basically slowing the rate of recovery and actually decreasing the height of recovery, meaning do 10 times 3 minutes, right? Which is a lot of work. I'm not suggesting doing it, but just using it as an example, you're recovering better from the first 2 or 3 intervals than you are from the 4 to 8 in the middle, and definitively probably from 8, 9, or 10, right? That's this ongoing or cumulative fatigue that's going on in there. Somehow you have to be able to model that. We think we model it, but again, we have to make some generalized assumptions of how you do that. One of the funniest things in modeling, when you get this specific, we think we have a lot of data and we have a lot of variables. We do not have nearly enough to make a system. I would never, and understand, I've said this before, I would never train by dFRC. And I know it's our metric and it's in our software, but as those of you who know me, I'm always going to kind of tell you the truth and make sure you have clarity. It's a good measuring metric. It's good anecdotal data. I'm going to show you ways to use it, but I would not train by any existing model that says go this hard into your depleted. It is not measurable. We do not have enough of the variables to make that accurate that you should train by it. You will create poor results if you do that. And I'll defend that 100 times if anybody has questions. So really, our solution is not perfect, but it is in progress. We've been learning a lot since we've launched it. I would look for us to be working with the Facebook group in early spring with some upgrade ideas and some better ways. And as you can see, what we're trying to do with that Facebook group is engage all the great knowledge in there and help us design and work through these solutions. Probably the key, though, and the one that gets us most, and that I see most often times when people say it's not working, is the dFRC requires, oh, you always have to have a typo for me, requires an accurate power duration model. And well, we'll take that D out here eventually. And that means you have to be feeding the model, as we've talked about numerous times. The number of people who will post and say, why isn't my dFRC right, or it's going way negative, but then we'll come back when I say, did you test? Have you done any hard, short efforts lately? And they say, well, no. The model doesn't predict what you can do. It's not a magic kind of crystal ball dealio where it understands you and predicts. You've got to feed it accurate data for it to be right. And that means we need an accurate range of performance, at least 30 days, but preferably 90 days of good data. It must have a max effort of short, medium, and long. Now, as you know, we've made that much easier for most people. And basically, as you introduce new input, peaks, that means the model is learning something new about you. So your fitness changes and you can hit a new peak. And this is important because it's one of the major problems we have. New peaks can affect the model. Remember the word peaks. I'm going to get into it. So when we start talking about the model's best testing practices, there's great videos on this on the WKO5.com. I've written a little ebook on it somewhere. Please follow the protocols. But basically what I will do, I run a baseline test at the beginning of each season or after an extended break. Then I'm going ongoing testing based on normalized residuals. I've actually shortened my ongoing testing down to 30 to 45 days. So I'm getting through all three, the short, medium, long, in 30 to 45 days. As I've used the unstructured testing format here, it's just so easy to slip in one short, one medium, and even that long one, which can be a little harder. It's easy enough to build those into training that I just do it and keep the model more clean and neat. I find if you do that and keep the model clean and neat, your dFRC rarely will ever go negative. And finally, you need to review your normalized residuals for confidence. And I'm going to show everybody normalized residuals and how to do that in a minute. So model structure, I'm not going to get into this. This is the baseline structure testing. By the way, I put this PDF in the documents in this webinar, so you can download the handout and have this, and now you'll have the testing. I'm not going to go over it. And then finally, you need to follow the ongoing test. So that's your baseline at the beginning of a year. Then every 30 to 45 days, you need the short, medium, long built into the system. You don't need to do all three at the exact same time, meaning you don't need to do your short, medium, and long on the same day, or even in the same necessarily week. Oddly enough, what I've built a habit, I just tend to be patternistic in my brain because I'm not smart enough, so I tend to try to build habit. So I try to do my short test in week 1 of a training cycle, my medium test in week 2, and my long test in week 3. I actually find it helps the long test. The person's a little bit fatigued, so buffers off a little of that anaerobic ability. And I just do that every cycle. I just build it in. This way I have it as a habit. I don't have to think about it. Excuse me. And I just blend it into workouts. I just might say, hey, go out and if, normalized residuals saying do a max 11 seconds, I'm going to say, hey, I need a 15-second full-on sprint from you Tuesday before, once warmed up. That easy. Look at your normalized residuals. This is in your power duration model. It's if you're using the model in the WKO basic or advanced view, it's in the power duration. You have normalized residuals. Normalized residuals, you guys, is just a fancy math word for distance from zero. That's an oversimplification, but it's what it means. So this is zero. This is your power duration. Imagine everything that lined up, every blue dot that was on this red dot is exactly the same. It means your mean maximum power is exactly the same as your power duration model. So when it's way up here or way down here, and you can see this is a pretty extreme one. Obviously that's for extreme effect, right? This person has to do some testing. You can particularly see it in this area, right? Or you can just look, we built in a system of saying, there's your short, it should be 11 seconds, and their minimum power target should be 903 watts. The goal is to exceed that, not hit it. I almost regret doing that because I get that question a fair amount. You should try to exceed 903 watts. 143, so it's max, right? Then you can see in here, the model suggesting the best test would be here at 143, and they should try to exceed 448 watts. And then finally, 47 minutes happening right out here. Now the trick for me, like if I was looking at this, I would prioritize by normalized residuals. I'd have the athlete fix this first, right? You can see this is the biggest area, the furthest distance they are away. So I might say, okay, well, immediately test this. Then which is the next one? Probably this, and then this one. And then once you've got your model reasonably clean, you can go to the 3-week cycle like I was explaining. And that's a great way to use normalized residuals. Why this is so important in dFRC is you have to remember, and I've kind of gone over this a fair amount of time in other webinars, is your power duration curve is a combination of your anaerobic and aerobic capability, right? So some of that contribution is coming anaerobically. And I probably could have shown the anaerobic contribution here, the chart that we have, but some of that is anaerobic and some is aerobic. So if you're not testing short stuff, your FRC is going to be too low and your FTP will be too high because the system, the model thinks you're making that energy aerobically because it doesn't know you have more anaerobic capability. Once you test that anaerobic capability, suddenly go out and crack out a really good 1 minute, right? And the anaerobic side goes up, your aerobic is going to go down slightly in response. It is it's like a teeter-totter, right? They work together. So just keep that in mind in the testing protocol. Now, when it comes to testing, I would test no matter what sport I was doing. It depends, right? If you're really using the power duration model at the core of your format, which I do, I can only tell you my system. And because I want eye levels, I want optimized intervals, and I want to be able to track the physiological change. I want to be able to look at dFRC and those things accurately. And plus, I just find it a less stressful way than constantly formalized testing. Yes, in all sports, you should practice the same format. The challenge with running and using the power duration curve and then therefore dFRC, that runners are most susceptible to having a bad model and then not having dFRC work correctly, because what I see in runners is they either A, don't do the short stuff. Very few runners want to sprint, right? They don't want to go out and do their 10-second sprint as a test. But if you want the model to be accurate, you got to have a sprint in there every 30 to 60 days. You got to have that short stuff, a hard sprint. I would say if I was a runner, I would try to get a 50-meter sprint in once every 30 to 60 days. I would run a quarter mile. That shows my age, right? I'd run a 400-meter. I'd run one lap around the track hard. And then, just make sure you get in a good 5K, maybe a little longer. And that usually is enough to maintain a model. But I would do it across all sports. So when I was showing the targets here, is those targets really are just what you should exceed, meaning that's what the model is suggesting you should be able to do, not what your current mean max power is. So it's a good target, but the goal is to exceed that target. It is the current value of the power duration curve. So I think I answered all the questions on that testing protocol. If I missed one, ask again. All right, so here we go back to the dynamic functional reserve. I just want to show you a couple of things that you can easily identify from. Then I'm going to get into the polling Q&A, or the poll that I did, and then we're going to jump into some actual work. So people ask all the time, and this is really the idea of a case study. So I'm just going to tell you my thinking, and I could have marked this up a little in hindsight, I guess. So here is this person's dFRC is about, or their FRC is about 24. I should have kept that up there. That was stupid. But I know it's about 24. And here is 0. You see I put a dashed line here at 0. So if this person goes out and they're doing 4 times 8-minute intervals, so a longer VO2 max interval, somebody might call that. And you can see here, they're going deep, but not really deep. This person is kind of holding back. And I can see they were supposed to do 4, and look what happened here. Somewhere they just, I don't know, sort of pulled the plug. What happened here, So I don't know, was there other fatigue here? But I would quickly look at this. And again, I tend not to overthink things, right? This data, it's good data. You can really use dFRC for any interval shorter than 10 minutes. It's very telling about where they're going hard. Would I expect the athlete to go to 0 in 8 minutes? No. Would I expect them to get, pretty deep into their FRC? Yes. And what's pretty deep, right? More than half, at least, and typically 2/3 would be a good number. But you can see here, this person just didn't dig deep. I would look at this workout and say the power numbers might be, whatever, good, bad, other, but they absolutely had a little more anaerobic capability in the tank. And this is not a good workout. They only went to here. You can see they struggled to throw down. They got this deep, and that cost them, so they had to lay up in power. By this one, they're not even draining that battery hard. And by this time, they're done. So something was going wrong in this workout. So if I just looked at power, it would not look that bad, would it? I mean, obviously there's some oddity going here in interval 4, but by looking at their dFRC, this athlete wasn't going deep in that workout. Now, who knows? Maybe that was by design. Maybe for some reason it was don't go any harder than this number or whatever. But the reality is they weren't, if you're doing a VO2 max interval and you're looking to trigger, I bet you if we overlaid this on the VO2 max model, they were never really close to VO2 max. They weren't banging away at that anaerobic energy. But then I look at this workout, and this is an interesting case study. So this athlete this looks like 4 times 4-minute intervals is what the list says, but they obviously did more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like about 6 times 4, maybe 6 times 3. Maybe they kind of changed up the rules. Yep, that's what it is, 6 times 3. So you can see they start off, they're a little conservative on the first one, but man, then they turn on the heat, right? They jam that second one, and look here, it's -8. So here we see, here's your 0 line. So they go -8 in this workout. And I am going to answer the negative question in a minute. But what I like to see again, even though maybe they would have been better off doing the second one, not quite so hard, is then they repeat it. That's what I'm looking for. What I want to know, like if this athlete could have stayed closer, that's the quality in case study. I'm looking for the relationship of the dFRC dive in each. And visually, if you stay away from over specifics at first, you can see, without looking at power or anything, this person went deep on interval 2 and 3, and then they began to come apart. As a matter of fact, if we looked at the power, I remember I have it on my screen behind it here. They went from about 330, 340 watts here to about like 290, 300 here. They popped. Why did they pop? Too much. They went out a little too hard. You can see the spiky start, and they just emptied the tank. And they kept getting stronger, which was great. But they weren't doing a good job. The data, what was actually happening in their FRC probably wasn't connecting with their feelings. Somewhere in their brain, they were saying, I'm going to go hard. I want this perfect interval. And were they exceeding the prescription or what? My guess is they were exceeding the prescription. Then we can see they paid the price. They just couldn't go that deep anymore, even with a better little anaerobic recovery. So these 3 intervals were not as impactful. Another look, here's the same 40-20. I'm not going to do that again that I showed, but you can see here, this to me is a really good workout. It's, I might want to see a little deeper here, but this is what I like to see when I'm looking. They go deep, but they don't exhaust. Okay, they've tested the waters. They're feeling their legs today. So they go a little deeper. They don't exhaust. Okay, they're recovering well. They go a little deeper. Now they're getting there. This athlete's starting to hurt, right? These 40-20s are starting to take a bite. Then even then, they had the range, and you can see it here in the power as they were moving on. They really emptied the tank in the end. That's a really good workout. It might be they might have held back a little too much here. They could have pushed a little harder. So to me, that's how I'm using it. That's how I'm using it in a general fashion. I have some other specifics, and we'll kind of get into that in the Q&A when I jump in and I answer your questions. But that's really it. I mean, in a workshop, I don't want to get into here's the exact and 1.25 and specialized charts and this and that. I have a couple of other tricks in dFRC that I'm not, I haven't put into this program, and some things we're going to talk about in some upcoming releases, but that gives you a good idea of just starting to work with dFRC. So now I'm going to jump into the group questions, and then I'll go into WKO myself and show a couple of things, and I'll take any questions. What I really hope out of the workshop is get really good Q&A. I've taught the ideas of FRC before and even dFRC. What I really want to get into is the discussion and help. So the poll gives us insight of questions that people had. Some I've already answered, as you're going to see, and some I haven't. So in this order of grabbing, top question that was asked was, what does the system need to make dFRC accurate? I pretty much already told you. Feed the model, follow the testing procedure, make sure you're maintaining your normalized residuals by the testing. But remember this statement. I'm going to come back in a moment because this gets mistaken a lot. The interval is not the test. Remember that one. Next question. I skipped a case study because I've kind of showed you some, and I'm going to get into some more. What drives post-interval recovery, bringing back FRC, to tell when you are ready to light another match? That question is where the future of dFRC lies. I would currently say it's not accurate enough in the recovery to absolutely bank on it. Yes, download the data when you're done, and then analyze it against the athlete or your own, if you're the athlete, your feelings. I was ready to go. Well, the data said you were ready to go. I just wasn't ready to go, but the data thought you got to do a little of subjective and objective data. Here, you got to do a little bit of that analysis. The reason it's so hard, we talked about, is all these variables because it depends. Where's your current training and fitness? What's your nutrition been like? What's your overall FRC? Very high FRC people can repeat more. They simply have a bigger battery, right? What about glucose and glycogen storage? There's a host of other things, because this is why no one's ever cracked this challenge of measuring anaerobic work capacity or dFRC accurately. It's that recharge rate that's so hard. So my advice to you is to look at it anecdotally, measure it against athlete feelings, but do not specifically use it for when to go again next. I have a feeling that if you're maintaining it, you'll get a pretty good feel. It'll be reasonably accurate. I just wouldn't bet the farm on it. So good guidance, but not an absolute, might be a way to say it. And really, when you come back is when the funny thing that people are forgetting to do is use history, right? So if you're going out to do 4 times 40-20, look what happened here. I would look at the power of this interval, right? What did I do? What was I hitting? What was this athlete doing? And I might rejigger my targeting a little bit and tell them and give them deeper guidance on the first one, because I could see this took, and you look at the recovery rate. They just were recovering. They're not going to come back. There's not enough rest time to come all the way back up. That gives you insight. Use your own history or your athlete's history of their performance. Look at it and use that to guide the new one. So this is a really good question. Why doesn't FRC adjust when dFRC goes negative? And that's my point. The interval is not the test. And this is a mistake. Think about it. Yeah, John, I knew it was coming. So the reality is, let's say you go out and you do a series of 3-minute intervals and you go hard. It's hard. All right. And on the third or fourth one, you go negative. Third, fourth, and fifth one, maybe you go negative, right? You would typically look at that and say, well, cool, I went negative in that 3-minute run, right? So therefore my dFRC should adjust tomorrow, or my model should adjust tomorrow. But the reality is the model is not the test, meaning your normalized residual in the short area might be saying you need a 1-minute maximum or a 45-second maximum. And that should have been, the model suggesting that's a target of 500 watts. But you will go out and do a 3-minute effort at 325 watts. There isn't a peak power high enough in that interval to force the model to readjust. Now, you might be going negative because you're more fit than you know. So here's a bit of advice. If you're doing intervals like 3-minute intervals, and I'm just using that as an example, it could be 2-minute intervals or 4-minute intervals, whatever, that go negative, look at your middle normalized residual, right? I'm just jumping back there. Look at your medium range normalized residual, right? And you want to just learn something real quick, test that. Get fresh for a day. You might be able to do the next day or whatever. I would not train, but test that. So if you have negative numbers, test your middle number. And first of all, you typically won't see a negative number. If you do, it typically means something is wrong in the model. Even though if you're doing my 3-minute example, there isn't one section of data hard enough in there to correct the model. So that should tell you, go look at my normalized residuals and test that medium short. It's usually telling you if you'll test that medium short, it'll work, because the reality is either go back to this, it typically means your FRC is too low because you haven't been testing it, and your FTP is a little too high because you haven't tested your FRC. So if you go nail that medium and then go do the same workout at the same power, I bet you it won't go negative. That's kind of hard to explain. I hope you guys get that. Think about it. You just don't have the peak power in an interval. The model's based off mean max power. So the indicator is, oh, I went negative. That's an indicator something's not right in my model. But because you were doing 3 minutes at an even power, you don't have the peak power to adjust the model. That should tell you, go look at that. Like, I know this, right? I would guarantee if this person went out and did 3-minute intervals, they're going to go negative. Well, I don't know. This is such a high peak here. But they probably would go negative. So in which case you come back and test this. And then if you repeated that same exact workout, it won't go negative. It's just a result of the model. The model is based off mean max power. Rarely ever do you do a mean max power best in an interval, because you got to keep repeating it, right? It's energy over time. It's effort over time. So that is crucial to understand. And every time you see it, you see me say in the group, well, you need to test. Show me, and I always say, show me your normalized residuals, and no one does. But if they did, I guarantee you would see what you just saw there, a big gap in that middle area, and they need to fix it. So David, FRC and FTP is an inverse relationship. Yes and no. Actually, save that question. I'll just show you in WKO. It's a little easier to explain it in there. So finally, questions here are, can dFRC go negative? Yes. And I've explained mainly the reasons why just now. If you're understanding what I was saying about if you go negative, that tells you you need the test, then you understand what I mean. If you understand that, your model will rarely ever go negative. Rarely ever go negative. And if it does, That's telling you need the medium, maybe even the short. A couple of times I see both the short and medium, typically with runners, actually. I see they need the short and medium test. Once you clean that up, it works great. So yes, it can go negative, but even then in a perfect model, it can occasionally go negative, but it's pretty rare and it's pretty small. The model's pretty good. The dFRC is really good if the model really reflects what the athlete's short, medium, and long maximum efforts are. So that is really a point. So I'm going to show you, sorry, I missed one question. There was a question about practical applications, the data, team pursuit, pull times as an early example, and training uses. I would look at it as more of a, so can you use it for track, team pursuit, time? Yeah, actually it's an excellent application as long as you don't become absolute. If you look at the pattern, because the track is so controlled and the time frame, if you're doing pursuit, is shorter, as we all know, you can get a pretty good understanding of the effect. And you could set a pretty good, if you did a fair amount of testing, I bet you can get it within a couple of seconds of perfect. So that's a great way you can use it. I know a fair amount of teams use it for that right now in team pursuit, how long that person should pull and how high. Don't forget though, you need to translate that to velocity, because you want that time and output of effort to be at a higher speed, at the best possible speed. But that is an excellent use. Other uses are really all about the depth and intensity of training. Meaning you can review training, understand how deep the athlete or yourself went, understood. I want to see, when I'm doing anything in aerobic, I believe that you should basically deplete, meaning you should go basically to zero or close to, if that's the goal. There's a lot of applications for racing. There's a lot of applications for racing here. And I think in the spring, we'll see people begin to look at being able to do post-race evaluation. The funniest thing, right? I see other programs that measure this, and they might have a Garmin app that measures it. And I'm not being negative to anybody, even though I sort of am, because it just makes me crazy, to be honest with you. And you have some meter on some battery on your screen, and you're like, the battery says, I have this much energy left in racing. But the reality is it's too dynamic. You don't know how much you're recovering. In racing, you tend to recover worse than in workouts, right? And if you can't go, you can't go, and if you can go and the model's saying you can't go or the model's saying you can go, it really comes down to just keeping up with the dynamic nature of the event. Models and data is descriptive. Racing and performance, that's feel. Use all of this data, use things to capture that feel and learn how to do it. That being said, dFRC is an excellent post-race analysis. You can see places where you went deep, didn't lay up enough to recover, got to the finish without enough in the tank, blah, blah, blah. So Greg, great question. Greg asks, I've used SMO2 as a similar type to indicate emptying the tank. Is there a good correlation between dFRC and oxygen uptake? Yes. I haven't studied it, but my expectation, knowing what it's based on, yes, there would be a pretty solid correlation. The pattern would be the same. The depth would not, because dFRC is basically happening in the absence of oxygen. It's a slightly different measure, but I think you would find the patterning of the data the same. Roy, are there separate charts, indoor and outdoor measurement of dFRC? No, but yes, you could do that by a sport type, the new sport type system. If you use indoor and whatever, it will use that FRC as the main starting number in that model. Could you comment on what changed within WKO that you decided that it was good enough to use now? Do you mean, Duncan, I assume you mean like what were we doing that we assume it was good enough now? To actually, in WKO4, as most of you know, we wouldn't implement dynamic FRC because we couldn't get it right. Actually, and again, just being honest, it was working. We worked with Ryan from Best Bike Skillet, so you guys might know. Ryan is a PhD in advanced mathematics, And he actually helped us solve some of the slow component math. That was giving us a lot of problems in WKO. We had a bunch of options and ways to do it, but we really needed somebody with the, not that Kevin Williams, who's a math ninja, and we, Andy is pretty darn good at the math also, but we really needed somebody who could take it to the next step, and that was helpful. And then two, we simply needed the testing time. We've been testing dFRC for 4 years to get it this close. And three, to be honest with you, it took us years of WKO4 to convince people to test. Like if you want to use you can train on any method you want, but if you want to use the power duration test, the power duration training format, I mean, look how many times I had to tell people you need to test, you need to test. I'm sure if you're following on Facebook, you guys wanted to kill me for saying it so many times. But the reality is, until that became an accepted norm, if we would have introduced something that was then downstream of that testing, i.e. dFRC, it would have just been insane. So part of it, we were also letting for the marketplace and the users catch up. If we use optimized interval chart, what will deplete FRC to 0, or at least close enough to stimulate the ideal response? Shane, great question. If you're using optimized intervals, and here I'll try to go to my, and I'm also breaking one of my others. And you guys, we're in the Q&A phase now. Ask away, and that's what I want a workshop to be done. Instead of hearing me just drone on off slides, ask what you want. But that being said, I'm using, notice I'm on a build you don't have, a couple ahead of yours. I'm testing something. So if something goes wrong, I apologize. I will secretly tell you we expect to have a new build out tomorrow, which will have an all cycling sport type, which everybody's asked for. So that's coming out. But I am testing. I'm actually a build ahead of that. So I'm testing things. So if something goes wrong, I apologize, but I think we should be fine. So one of the things so I'm in a workout here. I'm drilled into a couple of workouts. I've tagged a couple of workouts dFRC on my old Joe Rider. Some of this data is me. Some of it's some other people. It's kind of just a mismatch account, a sandbox. But basically, I'm going to go back a question. So don't look at that. So in the power duration model, one of the questions I got was the teeter-totter. So I'm going to go back here, sorry. Is the FRC and FTP an inverse relationship? So my point of why it's so important to have your model correct, right? And you can see this on the aerobic and anaerobic contribution to power model. This is the power duration curve, what's in red. The blue one, David, is your anaerobic power. The green one is your aerobic power. And if you actually track the red line, it adds up to be aerobic plus anaerobic is red. And it will do that everywhere except right here where you'll see a little bit of odd math. A little bit of odd math at that kink, that little point where you drop off FTP. So it always adds up. So think about it. If you suddenly go out and do a hard 45 seconds, so the blue gets higher, right? And you haven't, and this whole area gets higher, but you've done nothing new here, the model learns a little bit more about you and says, oh, at 20 minutes out, he was currently putting out 16 watts. He's still anaerobic. See it up here, 16 watts. He's still anaerobic. But now FRC goes higher because you put a test. The model will figure out actually at this point you're putting out 14 watts. Because your anaerobic power has gone up. It's still taking one from the other. So the blue line moves up. That means that you're probably not making the energy as aerobically, so the green line comes down a little bit. Then if you long test and pull the green area up, then it better understands the overall power's grown. That's why we have a short, medium, and long. So yeah, it is typically inverse, to answer your question. It is a typically inverse relationship, and that is how it works. Okay, getting into some of the demo questions. So if you use, if you're looking at different items, let's see, let's actually go back into the workout point. So couple of dFRC kind of talking points. One of the questions, so Shane, to somewhat answer your question, even though I'll go to optimized intervals in a moment and be more specific, is any work above FTP FRC really is the idea is that one of the major things you're attempting to do is to deplete anaerobic capacity, glycogen, and really you're trying to deplete glucose. It's glycogen in your muscle, glucose in your blood, oversimplification, but it is. So when you do intervals above, part of the benefit of going hard and doing those harder intervals is that depletion. Now, when you're doing FTP and sweet spot and maybe just over FTP, you go back more to when it depends. So any optimized interval that's higher than FTP, FRC and above, yeah, you want to do it to total depletion. One of the greatest indicators of that, if your model's been updated, is look at history and, potentially tweak your numbers. Optimized intervals for the power target tends to do it really well. But what question it won't answer is how many you can do, right? That's where the magic will lie. So if they're hitting power that the optimized interval is suggesting, and you've done them before, look at what that was. Let's say by the third interval they were depleted. Were they too depleted? And maybe they should only do 3. Did they have some energy left in the tank and they could have done 4? Okay, then add the 4th. Were they right on the border of depleted? Okay, then I would add that extra 1. So it really is a way, optimized intervals is the greatest impact. What optimized intervals really do is pick points on that power duration curve of time and power where they intersect that have the highest impact on the curve itself. That will directly relate then with proper drain rates, the decline of dFRC, but the magic will be in how many you do. If you maintain a well-maintained model and you use optimized intervals, when that athlete gets close to 0, 1 to 2 times, they'll be done. It'll collate every time. It's kind of funny because they're done, right? It's empty. So I know that was kind of a long answer to a short question, but use the optimized intervals. It's a good targeter. Use your history to determine how many, and as long as the model's accurate, it will give you a really good idea. Now, if they, some athletes, here's my caveat, and I'll put it all on the table. Some athletes can't get to 0. Maybe in a short peaky test or something, some people just aren't mentally tough enough for hard intervals to drop it all the way to 0. It's not just the physiology at play here, right? That's another way you can use this number. One of the things, like this one on my screen, I'm going to zoom it by clicking here. I might show this to the athlete and go, really? We really going hard? I wouldn't do it that way, but I'd ask them first, what was happening here? Were you really fatigued? Was it super hot? Were you at high altitude? There's all kinds of factors it could be, but I would want to know, right? This makes me want to find out. And that's really how I use it as a tool. They work pretty well for, let's take a look here at some microburst intervals. So here's this athlete going microburst intervals. It's kind of great. You see the mini recharges and burn downs, pretty good burn rate. They go deep on the second one, but they never really go. It's about -4, 5 at that lowest point. But then they're taking a longer break, so they're recharging pretty well, but they just can't go deep. They're losing power here. There's fatigue in place. Again, this might be the athletes sprinting a little bit. The on surges were a little too hard. You can see actually what happens here is they lay up. So maybe in here they were surging a little too hard. So I might I might zoom in on that interval. You know what I mean? And I might want to look at it deeper and just say, oh, is there something going on there? So it just leads me to want to work. Here's a great case study. So testing. So this athlete was doing a 5-minute VO2 max test, day 1 of the structured protocol. Let's assume their model was reasonably decent. Usually in the baseline, your model's usually pretty decent, right? Because you're carrying over some data from the end of your summer. They emptied the tank, right? And then some. Obviously, the model wasn't being maintained. They went very zero, but you can see they were digging here in the end. You can see the drop off in power, right? And then they mentally, that got tough right there, and then they dug to the finish. So like I see that, good test. I would look at this and say, could the person have gone harder? Probably not. You might look at it and say, well, what if they did equal power? It wouldn't have been different. They emptied the tank early in and held on hard, was what it was. So good test. Some general, sorry, my screen's a little slow, you guys. The webinar thing slows it down. I look at this, too hard. These two intervals were too hard, popped them. They couldn't go deep. So it really is that simple. Be careful of the specificity of the number. It's really the visual that drives the boat. And then there might be reason to dig into the specificity. Here's a great example I want to show because I get this question a fair amount too. So what should SST look like? So here's a kind of classic sweet spot, right? And sweet spot, you're beginning to gauge some anaerobic energy, but really is pushing against the aerobic side. So the reality is, here's somebody doing probably 2 times, what did it say, 25. And you see some by the time they're getting later, they're picking it up a little, some draw down, but not much. To me, that's sweet spot, right? If I'm seeing drawdown throughout all the sweet spot, and I couldn't find a perfect example of this, but I bet you there's people do it, they went too hard. And sweet spot probably is the one training level that people seem to always want to go hard, too hard. Once you kind of get up to that 90%-ish type of effort, you're like, I can go harder. So you do. So when you see them, like here's somebody doing them in a little more, when you see them like that, I'm starting to think the athlete, to me, yeah, they pushed that last one, right? But that's not what I wanted. I didn't want them draining that deeply. I wanted them aerobic, and it had a crisscross element by the prescription. But the reality is that gives me insight, and I could measure it probably by my prescription. But let's say, I was using a model prescribed level or a optimized interval, that would tell me they probably exceeded. That tells me, look at me. I go right to that interval and say, well, what were they doing here? Then I compare it to this is what it should look like. Looks like I can guess they have some strange terrain things going on here, and when they're really good, like if you do it right, here's one where the athlete was pretty equal, but I can still see they were probably going a little harder for a true SST interval. They're draining down what they shouldn't drain down. I think I've answered all questions now. Appreciate it. Just a little overview. I didn't want to get too deep into the science. I would say one of the areas that to watch for some pretty, one of the areas I think we could do some cool stuff with next year now as we've been gathering more data and using it and learning will be in the dFRC area. So I'm hoping to use the group. So John asks, will we see some pro level race files for the wow factor that show dFRC for a race? I didn't pull up any. You'd be surprised. It doesn't look wow when you look at it from a dFRC kind of point. As a matter of fact, it'll look pretty mundane. It's just not a matter of digging deep. It's other things. But I'll make sure I build some into the my other workshops as I go forward next year. It's funny, like you look at some of the professional athletes. So one of the athletes I coach is Rebecca Rausch. And you guys probably know Rebecca from, multi-time winner of Leadville, adventure racer, wrote a great book, everything, whatever. She has no FRC and she never goes into dFRC. It's so small, it's so whatever. So if you look at her race file or super hard, it doesn't even look as hard as this. It looks more like, it's only going to look like that. So dFRC isn't always the indicator of what is fun. Now we can go into some cool power files, and things like that as I go through the workshop, and I can show you just how strong some pros are and some of the other data, but dFRC isn't one that always indicates that. All right, cool. I didn't want to make a long webinar. I appreciate everybody being on. I'm going to post this in the next hour right up to WKO5. Thanks for attending. Feel free to ask any other questions in the Facebook group. Talk to everybody soon.